Hi, I'm Megan, and you're listening to Two White Girls Stumbling Through the Current Political and Social Climate. Hey everybody, it's Katie and Megan again.
Hey y'all.
Hi y'all. Last episode, Katie dove into her career and everything that goes with that, with refugee resettlement, gave us a lot of good information. If you haven't checked out the blog with that goes with that, please do. Katie put a ton of other new information in there. Katie, what's the blog again?
Blog is whitegirlshow.wordpress.com.
Yeah, so check that out. Today, I am going to be diving into my career, which is public education and all the lovely, wonderful, exciting things that go with that. So really, I'm going to be taking you through a race through time. And talking about where we started with public education, where we are now, and a lot of the things that we've kind of picked up along the way. And something that's really kind of crappy is that a lot of these problems, I think people are coming to understand because Donald Trump is president. But these are things we've struggled with for a long, long time. These are things that came long before him, and we will have long after him. So, you know, I'm glad we're awakening. Many people are awakening to it now, but this is not a Donald Trump sucks episode, although every episode is a Donald Trump
A little
sucks
bit, a little
episode
bit.
because he
Yeah.
sucks a little bit. But also, this is something we're going to be looking at a lot of things that have snowballed through the course of time. So if you're ready, let's jump in.
Get it?
You get it. So if you didn't grow up in the Midwest and go to the fun little camps, I don't know, Katie, if you ever went to one of these, where you went to the camps and you pretended you were like living in the 1700s and they made you go to school. And did you ever do that? I feel like every kid in the Midwest. You
No.
didn't do that? Oh my
No.
God. I've taken
We did the traditional camping situation.
But they didn't make
Or it's
you
like
pretend school.
no, there was
No.
never no.
Well,
I
okay.
guess
I thought that was a
I
very
went to a
Midwest thing.
I went to a very poor
Fair enough.
school, so I don't think they could afford
They're
that
poor.
kind of
And
trip.
my kids now are poor enough where they get scholarships, so you were kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
So if you did not attend one of those and you don't know, in the early 16 and 1700s, before we became an official country, school was really just for reading the Bible. The Puritans felt very strongly that children should be educated so they could read the Bible and understand the Bible. And I think they had, whether right or wrong, a very direct vision of what they wanted children to get out of education, which was to be good Christians and to understand the Bible. And we're going to come back to that idea of this vision of what education gives children. The Puritans may have been the last time we had a really strong vision of what the purpose of education is in our country. So that was a long time ago, but we'll get into that. And then we become a country. In the late 1700s, Thomas Jefferson is president. He's really the first president who takes a look at education. If you don't know much about Thomas Jefferson and you haven't seen the musical Hamilton, he was a fantastic elitist. He believed that there were laboring and learned people. So some people should go to trade laboring school and some people should go to learning school. And that should basically be decided based on your family status with a few ranking genius exceptions. That was what he used to say. Ranking genius exceptions. And so he really started this idea of who deserves what type of education, and that your family kind of discerns that for you rather than you deciding I'm a curriculum person or I'm a using my hands and working person. So moving way, way, way forward, Pennsylvania is the very first state that gives free public education, but it was only for children who were underneath a certain economic status, so poor children. Rich people still paid for schools, so that was a very progressive idea to have rich people still paying for schools and poor children getting to go for free. And then New York slowly followed. And Boston followed, being the very first city to have a free public high school for anyone, Boston Latin. And that was in the 1800s. Boston Latin is actually where my grandfather went to school. So it is still in existence today. and it is the oldest high school, and it was free for everyone. And that was a really, really, really big deal for this education to be free for everyone. That was not happening everywhere. Most people were paying for school or paying tutors or not attending school at all. And Massachusetts was the first state to decide that not only should you go free of charge, but that you should have to go to school. And like, again, you're going to see this theme of Massachusetts being way ahead of the rest of the country, way ahead of the rest of the country in public education, because they believed in this idea of free and appropriate education long before anybody else did. 1827 was, our country was still extremely young. And you're also kind of I want to point out that it's just individual states that are making these decisions. Thomas Jefferson was really one of the first and only presidents to make a grandstand about public education on a federal level. So when we talk about the American public education system, that's basically 50 different public education systems that all pretend to work together. And that really started with this idea that Massachusetts was doing one thing, Pennsylvania was doing another, and nobody else was doing anything with it, especially in the South. Southern states really did not have public education till much, much later, and we'll get there. 5% of slaves were literate at the time that the 1830s happened. It was obviously to a great risk of themselves. I'm constantly pointing out to my students that they did not teach slaves to read or write very intentionally, because if you know how to read or write, you can follow your rights and you can follow what you deserve as a human being, and you can fight for that, and it gives you more power. So the South very much saw education as a power struggle, and did not give it to many people at all. It was basically a tutoring system well into the early 1900s. And again, that's a theme now. The southern schools struggle more than northern schools. So this idea that things happened a long time ago, this is such a snowball effect. So the things that, yes, were happening in the 1800s, we're still seeing a pattern with today. What were we going to say, Katie?
And yeah, so like what's important with that is, because of my work at a national level, there is still, no matter what it is, no matter what the issue is, whether it's, immigration reform, public education, benefits, any kind of social services, the southern states are always less progressive than the northern states. Now, not to say one is better than the other, but in terms, and not that southern states don't do things a different way that may be better for them. Not really, but we're just going to hope.
Trying to be trying to be open-minded.
I'm trying to hope. Because I'd been in Atlanta and I'd been in Phoenix, and I got to talk to people and see what they were doing.
And those are great progressive places.
But it was still just something where it was like, oh wait, you have to fight against your state to do anything. Yeah. So just to touch on your point that it's still a thing. It's
still very much a thing. I have a friend who taught in Ohio for 5 years and then moved down to the Carolinas because her husband moved, and she was like, this is so different. And I don't think people realize, and my family, like I said, my grandpa went to Boston Latin, and we'll get to my family joining us as Irish immigrants in a second, but a lot of my family lives in Massachusetts, or extended family lives in Massachusetts on my mom's side, and I think they're very shocked even to hear how much better their education is from everybody else's education. And just this idea that, yes, we're one country, but because we started with the oh my gosh, not the Constitution, but the Articles of Confederation, which this idea that it was really states that pushed things forward and the federal government had very little power, really made us, especially in things like education and services and public services in general, it made a divide. So, states that thought that was important, or states that had money, did that. States that thought that wasn't important or had slaves, so they didn't, or, sharecroppers who they didn't want to realize they were being underpaid, or they didn't want to know how to unionize or come together and fight for their rights. They didn't put a priority into that, and we're still struggling from that today. So moving forward in the 1820s to the 1860s, 3.1 million immigrants, coming to Katie, arrive in the United States. And our industry is booming at this point. So the vision of education shifts, and people are looking for education to create obedient, good workers. And that's, again, all in the North. The South has their obedient, good workers, if you will. But the North is looking for that industry people to educate. So that vision shifted, but it's not a full country vision. I just want to keep your mind on that. It's this Northern idea that school is going to teach you how to be in the workplace. Horace Mann then founds the Massachusetts State Board of Education. It is the very first state board of education. He thought that education was really important because he was an industrialist. Horace Mann was not an educator. So this is the first time we're seeing a non-educator realizing that education is important, but then also hijacking education for his own purposes. Another awesome theme that we're going to see throughout American history. He created a state board of education, and never was it intended for a teacher to sit on the state board of education and make decisions for the state education. It was intended for industry leaders to sit on state boards of education and give, this is what we need in the workforce, and therefore this is what schools should be doing. So keep that in mind. 10 years later, the Irish arrive because they're having a famine. That's my mom's side of the family.
Mine too.
Woo, Irish. And the Irish Catholics, which I am, are very much, it becomes a struggle between Catholics and Protestants who have been there for, a couple hundred years now. And it becomes this struggle for local neighborhood schools. So you start to see neighborhood schools pop up in Massachusetts, where you've got the Irish Catholic school and you've got the everybody else Protestant school based on the neighborhood you live in. And they started to kind of segregate themselves because both of them were interested in educating their children on their religion. And I don't know if you know the history of Catholics and Protestants, but it's not great. So they did not want to educate together. And they felt that their children in a Protestant school were being force-fed a Protestant curriculum. So again, another theme of, based on where you live and who you live near and the culture that you're in, that's where you go to school. And that was really important to the Irish Catholics. So they kind of pushed that forward. So moving on. Massachusetts officially makes it a compulsory education law along with a couple other of eastern states in 1851. So it was expected before that everyone go to school. This was an official law that said all children must go to education. Their vision in that law, as it states, is to get the children of poor immigrants, Irish, to get civilized and learn obedience and restraint. They were very concerned with this Protestant Catholic issue and that the Catholics were going to make an uprisal because Irish were seen as drunk and poor and dirty and awful. So we need to educate them so that they're not terrible. Notice again, I've not mentioned a single southern state. These were all the East Coast northern states that were focusing on this, especially Massachusetts. So in 1865, African Americans, after the Civil War, are freed, and they start to mobilize to bring public education to the South. I think this is another huge theme that you're going to see. African Americans have always been at the forefront of making sure that children are educated, because I think the newly freed slaves realized we need education so we can continue to mobilize, so we can continue to go towards freedom. During the Reconstruction era, which is probably, I would say now the second darkest, but one of the darkest times in American history, the southern states started to get public education, but the African Americans who fought for it really did not benefit from that. It was more beneficial for white children, obviously, because it was the white politicians who were putting into place what the African American people who were mobilizing wanted to do. So they were rewriting state constitutions to guarantee free public education, but it was not really given to black children. That's going to start a big theme here soon, because it's this idea that just because something's in a state or federal constitution does not mean that if a city or a state does not want to follow that, they don't have to. It doesn't mean they're going to follow that. Constitutions are a piece of paper, and everybody has to buy into that constitution. Especially in education, just because it says it on a piece of paper it should happen, it has not been our history to put that forward. And a great example of this is the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. And while Plessy versus Ferguson was not an education law, it very directly impacted education in the United States. If you don't know Plessy versus Ferguson, it recognized segregation as legal. Katie just made a face. You don't. I don't know. I don't know people who know history, people who don't. And I think a lot of people think history is boring. So I hope I'm not being boring now. But it's important. Plessy versus Ferguson is important. Separate but equal. That's where that phrase came from. And I know everybody's heard that, separate but equal. And it was really about railroad cars, but it allowed southern states to pass laws requiring racial segregation in public schools, and then essentially pumping what money they did have, because southern states were struggling financially at this time due to Reconstruction and lack of a plan for the economy after the Civil War. They were really, really struggling, so that what little money they did have was pumped into the white schools and left the African American schools to figure it out for themselves. So we're moving into the 1900s now. The NAACP brings a series of suits for unequal pay for black and white teachers and blacks and white students. There was pressure to increase spending on black schools in the South. Again, just because there's pressure does not mean that happened at all. Politicians respond oftentimes for pressure, but I think, in the last even couple of weeks we're seeing that's not always what happens. And so I really think unfortunately, and I think people really feel that education is a progressive part of our country's history. And I don't mean to burst everybody's bubble, but I'm kind of here to burst your bubble. We've had a lot of progressive pieces of paper. That's really what's happened. The very first educational testing service, yay, standardized testing, we'll get there. Carl Brigham, the originator of the SAT, created what is now the SAT in 1948. The point of the SAT, what is now called the SAT, was to prove that immigrants were feeble-minded or were not very intelligent. Because at this time, California was getting an influx of Chinese immigrants. They did not like the Chinese. They were unhappy that the Chinese were there. So he created this test to kind of decide who was really benefiting from education and who really just wasn't. And so standardized testing from its beginning was created to weed out minorities and other people who are not well fit for the standardized education system. But a few years later, we have a fantastic break in what is, I feel like, making sound like a dark history, called Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Yay! Woo! The Supreme Court decided that Plessy versus Ferguson, this essentially overturned it, and one of the only times in our current history the Supreme Court has overturned something a former Supreme Court has done. It abolished segregated schools and a segregated lifestyle. This was such a win for African Americans and Southern states in general, or should have been. But we know that a few years later in 1957, the Little Rock Nine, if you don't know, it was 9 students who tried to attend a public high school. They were 9 African American students. This was a predominantly or historically white school. It was such a national mess. The governor sent his National Guard to physically prevent the 9 African American students to attend this school. Then President Eisenhower had to send federal troops to go against the National Guard in this tiny little mini civil war that happened at Little Rock, Arkansas. He did not do this because he supported desegregation. Eisenhower did not support desegregation, but because he felt disrespected that the governor would use military power to defy the U.S. federal government. So while he's seen as a hero in this story, his intentions were not, they were not originally about desegregation at all. So again, as you can see, in 1954, it was stated that schools should be desegregated. In 1957, people still weren't doing that. And 45 years later, in 1998, a study was done by the Department of Education and shows that schools, especially northern schools, are just as segregated as ever. So we have this beautiful Brown versus Board of Education piece of paper, but people have to buy in and believe in that piece of paper. And we don't historically elect officials that care about that particular piece of paper. And we'll get into why desegregation was such a mess in a moment. New York City had a ton of issues about clashing over community schools. Once again, this idea that African Americans live in one neighborhood, white people live in another neighborhood. The white teachers are coming into the African American neighborhood, making decisions for the school that the African American community did not like. So this back and forth, you're starting to see not a shift, a rift between white teachers and African American parents. And a lack of African American teachers who can be there for their own community, teach in their own community. And that's a huge problem. Then we get to the 70s, and Richard Nixon, he kind of decides that we are not going to desegregate schools anymore. What they were originally doing, and if my parents were alive in this time, so they can kind of remember. So if your parents were alive, it's an interesting thing to talk to them about, is the busing. So our neighborhoods are segregated. People go to neighborhood schools, right? So the Richard Nixon originally was watching people being bused an hour from their neighborhood to another school so that they could go to school with people who didn't look like them. And while this was a well-intentioned idea, once again, the Brown versus Board of Education was just a law. It did not think about how you could roll out what desegregation of schools would look like. And that became a mess. Kids were on the bus for an hour in the morning and the hour in the afternoon. White parents were obviously very angry. That's when you start to see people moving to the suburbs. So basically, we just learned new ways to desegregate ourselves. So Richard Nixon stopped the busing. Busing was a huge mess, but he didn't decide that, he didn't think of any other way or care about any other way to create desegregation in schools. So white people moved to the suburbs, African Americans stayed in the city. Our schools were desegregated as ever. Thanks, Richard Nixon. So going through, there's another group of people that I haven't even gotten to yet, and it's sad because they were really just basically ignored for most of our history, and that group of people is people with disabilities. I have often heard people say, well, when I was growing up, kids didn't act like that. Oh, there were kids that acted like whatever way you're talking about. They went to a different school, or they were in an institution where they were abused and put away. So all the way much later in the 70s, we get our first idea of bringing people with disabilities into school and making sure that they're educated. And I think at this point, that's where we really start to see a shift in our education visions. Because there was this idea that we should educate, this theory that we should educate everybody, including people with disabilities. But then we were pushing standardized tests, which, as I said, are entire tests to just prove that there are certain people who are too feeble for education. And that's something that we've been fighting for in education ever since then. If we fast forward to 2001, when George W. Bush was extremely popular due to my least favorite day in American history, he was able to pass the No Child Left Behind Act, which was really the test kids a lot to make sure schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And what he didn't understand, and what I have not seen a single administration, including my beautiful Obama, understand, is that standardized testing, which No Child Left Behind essentially just ensure that there would be standardized tests for math and reading at every single grade level to ensure that children are learning. Standardized tests at their core, are created to weed people out of education. So to ask a child to sit for 2 hours and take this test, which my air tests are 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon per one test. They take 3 tests now. They used to take 4, but Ohio just voted to get rid of social studies test. To ask a child, with ADHD, let alone a child with autism, let alone a child with trauma, to sit for 2 hours in silence and take this test is the definition of weeding out kids who are not obedient in the way that a test asks them to be. So when you think about No Child Left Behind, what you're really saying is that all kids should be tested and all kids should be able to sit for 2 hours and be obedient and take this test. Not to mention the tests are created for a white child mind. So when they tell stories, it's going to be about white kids. When there are articles, it's going to be about white culture. And there is such a thing as white culture. Maybe that'll be a different podcast.
Write that down.
Yeah.
It's real.
So even just something simple as calling it a porch or a stoop, that word alone can hurt a kid, and not hurt a kid. Some kids have a schema, which is the filing cabinets in your brain. Some kids have a schema of what a porch is. Some kids don't. And that's not even always having to do with race. That's like what your house looks like and what the people around your house looks like. That's, do I live in a city? Do I live in a suburb? Which is often dealing with race, but sometimes not. And I can think of 100 other examples of questions that have stumped kids because of their prior knowledge, not because of their ability to grasp the actual standard. So No Child Left Behind also decided that schools that students were failing these tests at a high rate would become charter schools. So we get to the exciting moment in my life, charter schools. For those of you who don't know, a charter school is a school that is funded through federal money because there are failing schools around them. So take, for example, Dayton Public Schools. Dayton Public Schools is a failing school. The kids do not pass their tests at high exorbitant rates. I think it's like last year was 76%. I think. Don't quote me on that. But I think it was 76%. So 76% of these kids do not pass a school, so some of their federal money instead goes to a charter school. So parents have a choice of where to go. Charter schools do not have to follow the same disability laws. Charter schools do not have to follow the same desegregation laws. They also do not have to keep students who are not able to sit in their classrooms for XYZ reason. The biggest thing we see in Ohio is that funding comes in March. So there's a count that happens all the way up until March, and they count how many kids does the public school have, how many kids does the charter school have. That's how we'll allocate the money. After that week in March, you'll see an influx of kids get expelled from charter schools and come back to the public school. Public schools, when you expel a child, you have to pay for them to go somewhere else. A charter school does not have to pay for a child to go somewhere else when you expel them. So it's very easy to expel a child from charter schools. Yay. So it also No Child Left Behind did not provide any money or any means or resources for schools or teachers or principals to be able to help their students pass these tests. The Obama administration changed No Child Left Behind to Every Child Succeeds, I think. It was basically the same law. The only difference was it allowed kids to take the test in increments, like if you have ADHD or just generally trouble sitting like I do for 2 hours. I don't know if I have ADHD or just like normal human, whatever. It just changed the law to be the same thing. His administration also created the very first set of standards, the Common Core. And there are a lot of feelings on the Common Core. And I think I can put my feelings and a lot about the Common Core into the blog. So check that out. Because it's a very vast and complicated thing. The only thing I will say about the Common Core is that it proves once and for all that politicians will always truly struggle to understand education, because education is not something they can put on an election cycle. When you implement something in education, you have to implement it with fidelity in a kindergarten class all the way to the time that they're seniors. That's almost 20 years that you're going to wait to see progress with that. So you can't implement something. If you know, Barack Obama implemented a lot of things that boosted the economy and then got him reelected in 2012, right? Barack Obama didn't implement the Common Core. He is never ever going to be able to take credit for anything the Common Core does, because we're still only 5 to 7 years into the Common Core, and we've got states changing their minds and deciding they're not going to do the Common Core anymore because of a lot of reasons. So when you're constantly changing your target in education, you're never going to see any results from that. But you're also not going to see results if you pick a point and stay focused for 20 years. You personally are not going to see results. You're not going to be able to run an election cycle on that ever. It's not, and that's what makes education different from every other sector in the United States. It's completely different.
It's all about results, and if you don't have results to prove that what you're doing works or didn't work, I mean, you're not running your platform on that.
Like, yeah, and I think the data that you do, like, I'm constantly talking about data. I talk about data every single damn day, constantly looking at data. But the data that you have is all based on growth. So, you know, like the test, I give formative tests every single week. You know, I've got kids in the red, now they're in the yellow. Yay. You're still not able to run an election cycle on that. I know that's great. I know by the end of the year that means they'll be green. But you can't get up on an election cycle and say, ooh, we had a bunch of kids failing and now they're almost not failing. But that's, when you work with people, that's what progress is. It's slow, right, and it's over time, and you have to do things, again, that word fidelity, you have to do them with fidelity. The American education system has no fidelity whatsoever, and we're also vastly different from state to state. So God forbid you're a military family or your mom's job had to move you from Texas to California, because it's still, even with the Common Core, going to be vastly different from state to state, and your resources are going to be different. And don't even get me started if you have an IEP. Your IEP is going to be completely different. Side note with IEPs, if I have parents who are listening whose child has an IEP, I will add a lot of really great resources to advocate for your child at school in the blog. So check that out. So yeah, so today what we're seeing is segregated schools because we have a segregated lifestyle. If you look around the neighborhood that you live in, really ask yourself if your neighbors look differently than you. And that is how we're going to start changing our schools, is if people intentionally change their lives to be less segregated. If people intentionally talk to each other, move near each other, some people go back to the city, some people move to the suburbs, and we start mixing ourselves. We have really never in American history done that. And I can even see it in city schools. There is a white part of a city, typically, and there is a black part of a city, typically. I live in one of the 5 most segregated cities in the United States. And you can see, even within a district, the white schools get more resources, have more volunteers, have more business interest, have more money being pumped into them than the black schools, period. I saw it because I taught at a predominantly black school in a segregated city for 2 years before I left because I couldn't look at it anymore. Our education system is innately racist, and innately leaves out anybody who isn't a straight white child with no disabilities and no trauma or defiance whatsoever, which I mean, I can maybe name like 5 kids that I know like that, even white kids in the suburbs. So I also think back to that vision, you know, the Puritans had a very serious vision, and Thomas Jefferson had a very serious vision of what they thought education and the role of education should play. Because we have forgotten in our history that education was really to prepare people for the workforce, we have no vision for our education. We have no vision for what we want for our children. And that's why schools are failing. So you can call your kid's school and yell at them all you want. But if your school is failing, your society is failing. And we have failing schools all over our society. So we are all failing our children every single day by not only not funding schools, but not thinking to ourselves, what do schools need to be providing to children and families to make them the most successful?
What do you recommend for parents or even people without kids about schools in their area? What should they do? How do they make a difference?
Absolutely. I think the first thing is, whether you're a parent or not, you should really get involved in your school. Figure out where the kids in your neighborhood go to school and contact them and see how you can be involved. Can you be a tutor? Big Brothers, Big Sisters is literally everywhere and a great way to get involved in the schools. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, literally everywhere. Great way to get involved with the schools. A lot of schools have mentoring programs. So ask them where they're looking for volunteers, because I promise you schools do not walk away from volunteers. I will say this, though. If you are interested in volunteering at a school, you need to be consistent. You hurt, not help, when you are not consistent with children, or just consistent in helping people who work with children. So please keep in mind that that's something that you should want to do on a regular basis. The other thing is talking to your representatives in Ohio, especially. First off, figure out how your schools are funded. Ohio schools are funded based on property tax. So we always see these levies popping up. I know there are about 30 other states that also do property tax. So people have to vote for their property taxes to go up. That was rated unconstitutional in 1991. The year I was born. I was born in 1991. And the reason why that was rated unconstitutional is it's against Brown versus Board of Education. You have segregated communities, so you have poor communities, rich communities. We used to have somewhere in the middle of communities. And the rich communities obviously have more money to pump into their property tax than the poor communities, period.
Well, if you don't own your home.
If you don't own your home, there we go, right away.
You're not paying property tax.
Yep, bam. I mean, and again, housing, that's again something we can go on into when we talk about the war on poverty. But housing is a huge issue when you're in poverty. So you're not able to fund your schools, you're not able to give them money. So rich schools like the school that I attended have more money because there are rich people who live there.
Right.
So
and my public school was in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
So who was paying property taxes were farmers, because they own all the freaking property.
But their kids didn't go to school there, so they didn't care.
Some did,
okay.
Some didn't. But it was, and then also we were next to a very predominant university who, because they had the deals that they had, didn't pay property tax. So every time it was pushed on the shoulders of not necessarily the largest employer in the area, but on homeowners and the farmers in the area.
Yep. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that the university you and I attended pays property tax either, which therefore does not go into the schools. Thank you, Catholic institution. Get your shit together.
Amen.
Amen. Maybe we'll do a whole podcast on that life. But I think that, so even just contacting your representatives, finding out how schools are funded, and advocating that schools be funded equally. You can't unknow what I just said to you. Schools are not funded equally. We are not living up to the Brown versus Board of Education. We're not living up to IDEA, which is the Disabilities Act that came up in the 90s. We're not living up to any of those things because we don't have money to do so. And politicians are not going to follow a piece of paper if they are not pushed to. Just like schools are not going to follow an IEP if they're not pushed to. So if your child is on an IEP, you need to be very active with their teachers, very active with those meetings, requesting to know how things are going. Because at the end of the day, everybody's just in survival mode in education. So if something can get shoved under the rug and be illegal, something will get shoved under the rug and be illegal. The amount of illegal things I have seen go down in 6 years is insurmountable. It's more than I would. Oh, go ahead.
When I was in the public school with my English language learners, the refugee youth, I had to learn what the laws were so that I could see what they were doing, because the school wasn't doing hardly any of the required things you have to do for an English language learner.
And there are lots of teachers who know that, and their administration shrugs, and you move on because the administration's in survival mode and just trying to get the most state funding that they're supposed to get. So pass this freaking test and die. That's what it's at. That's where we're at right now.
Yeah,
So you
and
have to know the laws.
You have to know the laws. You have to advocate for students, and you have to advocate for people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves. I mean, I had to go to parent-teacher conferences for these kids because their parents couldn't. There weren't interpreters. The parents would be there, but they'd be like, "What is this?"
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't know what's going on. They have no concept of what the public education system looks like.
Yep.
Some of them weren't even educated. So I'm like there, and I'm like, I don't have kids, but these are my kids, I guess.
Yep.
And so I'm in the school, and I'm just like there with them, being like, I don't know what you're doing. How are things? Like, it's mind-boggling also that I was able to do that. Now, granted, I had all these documents signed. I was allowed to be wherever I needed to be and all this stuff. But
you have to go through that bureaucracy, too. And knowing that you have to go through that bureaucracy. I mean, it's very frustrating for parents. Since we have compulsory education laws, you can be what's called truant. So if your child doesn't show up to school, then you are arrested. They have a warrant out for your arrest. I have parents right now who literally have a warrant out for their arrest because their child's not come to school. I think it's like 10 days in a row or something like that. It's not many days. That's actually a lot of days in the school world, but it doesn't sound like a lot of days. It's not like a month.
And the difference too with truancy is it's not the parent calling in being like, my kid's sick or anything like that. For people who don't know, truancy is like your kid literally doesn't show up and the parent doesn't do anything. The parent doesn't call, doesn't say, doesn't show up. There's no notes. There's nothing. So
well, actually, in Ohio, the law just changed, and it doesn't matter if you have a note or not. So unless it's a medical note from a doctor, you can't just say like I had the flu, because if you miss 3 days, I had the flu. That's fine, but it's all evened out because it's hours now. It's not days, and I can't remember the amount of hours, but it's about 10 days.
Oh
so
my
you have
God!
to have like a medical note that says like I have cancer. Yeah, literally. So when a child is displaced, I just went through something like this recently. A child is displaced or a child moves. There's a lot of bureaucratic hoops you've got to get to make sure that child gets to the school they're supposed to go to. Because schools are also very picky about funding. So if your kid doesn't live in the district anymore, they're going to boot them out and make sure you get to that district. But there's so much bureaucratic red tape. And we'll talk about how bureaucratic red tape really hurts people in poverty later, but there's so much red tape you have to go through. If you don't know the red tape you have to go through, a lot of parents end up going around in circles with our school secretary, bringing in document after document after document, trying to get their kid into school, and now they're truant because their kid hasn't been in school because they're trying to enroll them in the correct school, and it's a huge cycle. So please research the education laws in your area, whether it's local or state, and figure out where the disconnect is, because really, unless you live in Massachusetts, you definitely have a disconnect. Something that teachers can do is to look into culture responsive teaching. I will do a whole blog post on culture responsive teaching and the importance of teaching to the students that are actually in your room, knowing the culture and the family life and the beauty of the students that are in your room, rather than having an idea in your mind of who's in your room, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's, not everyone's going to look like you and have the same experiences that you have.
No, and we have teaching is predominantly a white female, and that is not predominantly who we are servicing. And finally, support your teachers, especially teachers who are minorities. Your male teachers, men are a minority in education. Your Black teachers, your Hispanic teachers, all these kinds of people, support those teachers too and encourage them. Because they are really doing a lot for their students just by being them. So, yeah.
I mean, everybody knows, and it's like this joke that like teachers are paid poorly,
yes,
and that teachers give so much of their own money back to their students.
I spend about $2,000 a year. I will not lie to anybody.
And this is like, people act like it's a joke or it's funny, and it's like, that's really sad, guys.
It
like
is.
That's not cool. Like,
it's
that's
sad
not
that we have
funny.
to crowdfund. And when we talk about the female experience, I'll talk about this too. I do believe that is because it's a female dominated profession. Because nurses have some of the same problems that teachers do, in terms of pay and being taken seriously. The final thing you can do is support teachers' unions. Unions are becoming wildly unpopular. And I don't know if you noticed in recent history, whether it was in Ohio or Minnesota, don't fuck with teachers and don't fuck with our rights, because we got to show up for our kids. And in order to show up for our kids, we need some money to do that. We need some schools that don't have mold in them. We need resources to do that. So know that teachers, when they're fighting for their rights, they're really fighting for their kids' rights. They're fighting for your kids' rights. They're not fighting to not show up for work. I don't wake up every morning and hope to not go to work. I love my job. I want to be there. I want to be there with your kids. So if I'm walking away from my job and not getting paid, that is because something is seriously wrong with your child's school and your child's education system. And you should know, all of you, something is wrong with our education system. So support teachers' unions, call the unions, figure out what do they need. Do they need money? Do they need people? What do they need to do the best they can for teachers? Because unions are shrinking in our country, and I think teachers are kind of the last profession to really have them, and they're shrinking too. So we need to support them.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. So that's education in a wrap. Thank you for going on a 45-minute wild ride with me. I hope it wasn't too depressing. I do really want to focus the fact that a lot of the problems we're seeing in our Trump presidency. Notice I didn't even mention Betsy DeVos because she's her own little special human, and whatever she does to mess up my job will be what she does.
I want to point out, yes, I haven't forgotten who voted for her.
Yeah. Okay? No. Yeah.
I just want to say, I haven't forgotten you.
I haven't forgotten. We won't ever forget. We won't ever forget. Our memories
Rob
are
Portman?
long. Our memories are long, Rob. I have called your office so many times. Never get through to you. Anyway, what was I going to say? Oh, I want you to know that while these are problems that are just coming to surface because of people like Betsy DeVos, because of Donald J. Trump, these are problems we've had since the beginning of our time together as a country. So we all need to take a little bit of ownership for that, and we all need to mobilize, and I'm glad that we're mobilizing. But know that it's going to be a long road to get us to where we need to go, and we all just need to pick up our little part of the pebble and put it on the mountain and create our little masterpiece together. But it's going to be a long road, so get involved in education. Please, 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 because they just never talk about it enough. Ever.
Yeah, and I think it's, when you mentioned that, like, it's not something that's put on a platform for anyone running for election because there's not necessarily this hardcore amount of data that, like, supports it or is fast enough necessarily. I think that's really important because I think that's kind of going to end up being a theme, is that anything that we're going to talk about, so many different issues and so many different topics, and that's going to be something that pops up over and over again. It's that you don't know about it because they don't want you to know about it.
Yes, and that's so intentional about education. They don't want you to know about it, period.
And yet all of us are in it.
Mm-hmm.
All of us are touched by it in some way because either I went to a public school, I have friends who have kids who are in a public school, I have friends who are teachers in a public school, or any school, school.
I mean, like, they are preparing for the workplace, for better or for worse, whether it's flipping burgers at McDonald's or a CEO. You went to school at one point or another. So if you're unhappy with the workforce that's coming forward, you should be unhappy with the schools, which means you should be happy with what society is providing for those schools, if that makes sense.
And something I really liked that you said was just that education is power.
Yeah.
And my experience with refugees is education is all of their goal. All of them. Whether it's actual full, like, high school, like GED, like their full education, whether it's going to college, whether it's just learning English, which also doesn't happen overnight.
No, does not.
All those people that yell at people in grocery stores about how they need to speak English. It takes a minute, by the way. Have you tried to learn another language?
How many languages do you know?
I don't want to even start. But, the education is power. It's what people hold over other people. This is what regimes do.
Yep.
They attack education, educators, journalists, teachers.
People who tell you truth.
This is, this isn't going to stop, and it's not over. And what's key is that our history, the United States history of slavery, is fundamental in everything. In every state, everywhere.
Everything that we do and everything that we say.
So I think people really need to understand that. But
we'll get into that more.
Oh, yeah.
At another time, I guess. But again, thank you for this wild ride of education. if you have questions, tweet them at us. Write them on the blog. Comment on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can see the answers to the questions. Everything is Two White Girls Show. Twitter is Two White Girls Show 1. But also look for my blog that will be coming out. Katie said it at the beginning on WordPress, that will have a lot of different facets going deeper into some of the things that I touched on today.
And we have everything, all the links to everything everywhere. Twitter, yes. YouTube, the WordPress site, everything is everywhere, so you can find us.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. We will
Thanks,
be back.
Guys.
Bye.